Three, two, one. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Object Source Lighting. My name is David Diamondstone. My website is lightminiatures.com. I'd love you to visit. And I'm going to be talking about object source lighting, which is, I think, one of my favorite techniques in miniature painting. I really enjoy light and creating an appearance of interesting lighting, whether that is a zenithal light, a dramatic like spotlight effect, or a colored light, whether that's coming from the miniature or off camera. That's one of my favorite things to do in miniature painting, but especially like object source lighting, where you have part of the miniature that is glowing, that is trying to create the illusion that part of your miniature is actually glowing, even though it's all just done with paint and there's no actual glowing object, no LEDs as part of this, just the paint. So that's one of my favorite things to do. I've spent a lot of time trying to do it better and trying to perfect it, looking at how light looks in TV and movies to try and duplicate that effect better. And so I'm going to share today in the next 2 hours what I've learned and how I think you can do the best sort of effect like that. So object source lighting is really about creating an illusion. You're trying to make the viewer believe something that's not actually true, which is that part of your miniature is
Hey,
actually...
David.
Yes?
I don't mean to interrupt you, sorry, but they're saying you're pretty quiet, so you might want to
Um,
boost your mic and turn me down, maybe.
I can turn you down.
Yeah, you should just do that anyway. That's just good old fashioned advice.
Um, how is the audio? So I can turn Justin down, and then maybe if you just turn up the overall audio, hopefully that'll work. Because I think my broadcast volume for my mic is the max it goes. So hopefully you can hear me. Let me know if there are any more issues. I'll try to take a look at chat while I'm giving my intro spiel.
And he also has me writing herd.
Yes.
I'm
Also have
watching chat.
Anne writing herd, so she can help out. So as I was saying,
Freestyle said it was working, so let's. If anyone, yeah, if there's any more audio levels, let us know, guys.
okay, that's good. Um, hopefully turning Justin down has mostly solved the problem for folks. So as I was saying, it's about object source lighting. The technique is about convincing the viewer of something that's not really true. It's about creating an illusion so that they believe that part of your figure, or at least they can suspend their disbelief and see. You want it to be obvious to the viewer that what's really supposed to be happening, and hopefully it'll actually look like it is happening, is that part of your miniature is casting light on the rest of the miniature and therefore create that illusion. And because it is about creating an illusion of something that's not true, you need to sort of follow the same principles that determine how light acts. If you're not following those same principles, then you will, betray the illusion, and your viewer will see that doesn't look right. We all sort of intuitively understand how light works, even if we don't know the rules. So when we see something that looks off, we know it looks off, even if we can't really understand why it looks off. We'll just know that doesn't look like light. I don't know what's going on there, but it just doesn't look like light. And your viewers will just not, not like the effect. So in order to create that illusion, I think it's really helpful if I can sort of spell out what are the rules that you need to follow, what are the rules that light follows that you need to follow in order to create a convincing illusion. And even though you may have heard that in art there are no rules, I think this sort of effect, it's like a trompe l'oeil effect where you're trying to create a simulation of something that's not actually true, but you're trying to create an illusion. In that case, you really do have to follow the rules, or else you will destroy that illusion and it won't work very well. So I'm going to talk about what are some of the rules of light physics that you need to follow. Let me actually put this. Oh, this is not even worth putting in frame.
Put your pretty minis back in the
I'll
frame.
put my pretty minis back in the
That
frame.
way they can think about the rules while you're reading them and see
Yes.
them on your minis.
Okay, so there's 5 rules. You can also see them on my website if you go to the OSL tutorial on my website. But the 5 rules, the first one I call the cardinal rule of OSL. And that is that lit areas always appear brighter than surrounding unlit areas. So you'll see in this figure that, the hands, the palms are the lit areas, and those are brighter than at least the shadow around them. This can be a little bit tricky with a figure that has multiple light sources. Like this guy has a top-down light source as well as the fire. So with those two in balance, sometimes there's like it won't necessarily be brighter than where it's lit by the other light source. But it does need to be at least have a line of shadow around it so that you can see that where the light's falling is lighter than the shadow area around it. So this is particularly noticeable, I think, on the bottom of his turban, where you have the light and then you have the area of shadow and then you have the other light. Of course, if you have something like these Kingdom Death minis, where most of the light is coming from the object source, it's really apparent that it's lighter than the surrounding areas. And this is both the physics of how light works, because of course if you have light of a color or whatever, it's going to illuminate as well as color the area it's hit. But it's also something that I see violated a lot, even by some really, really good painters will make this mistake, where if you're just like glazing with orange but not creating light before you glaze with orange, you can really easily end up making it darker as you make it orange or whatever the color your light is, and that will make it not read as light, because in order to read as light, it has to be lighter than the surrounding areas. So that's the first rule, the cardinal rule of OSL: light areas always appear brighter than surrounding unlit areas. The second rule is that lit areas are no brighter than the light source. So no matter what light source you have and how bright of a white or reflective an object you see, you'll never see a reflection of light that appears brighter than the light source itself, and you should follow that rule on your miniature. And it doesn't have to be the entire light source, but at least the brightest part of your light source should be at least as light, if not brighter, than the light it's casting. So for this figure, I've actually put a lot of just solid white in the fire. It all reads as green because it has green around it, but actually if you look at the lightest part, it is just a pure white paint that I've used. And I always like to base coat all of my light sources white before putting in whatever color, in order to make sure I can create that intense, lightest, brightest color I can. And that helps follow this rule. So I definitely recommend base coating white whatever you're trying to make glow. If you're trying to make a glowing red thing, then paint it white before you put the red on, and that'll help your red be lighter and brighter than it would be if you just put red paint over a darker base coat.
Everybody's taking notes. Keep going. It's great.
So the third rule is that the apparent color of a lit object should be affected by both the color of the object and the color of the light. This is, I think, the most complicated rule, because figuring out what the color should be is sometimes a little tricky. I think the best way to do it is actually get a light source, if you can, a colored light source. Find an LED, maybe one of your electronics devices has the right color of LED, and just like experiment in a dark room with what color you get.
Christmas tree lights.
Yeah, and suggest Christmas tree lights. That could be a good way of doing this. The other thing you can do is just take your phone screen and load up an image which is just that color and fill your entire phone screen with that, and that can be like your poor man's light source. If you don't have a brighter version, it works actually pretty well. And the other trick you can use if you don't have reference handy or you can't create your own reference by having a light source is that light and colored surfaces mix roughly the same way that paint colors mix, not quite the same way, so you might have to fudge it a little bit. And you have to remember that when you mix two paints, even though the colors mix sort of the same way light does, it doesn't create that illuminated effect. So you have to sort of add more light and sometimes add more saturation to compensate for the fact that it's just not quite the same thing. And the last, so those three rules, I think the first two rules are the really critical ones that when I see them violated, it kind of ruins the effect. So I would really suggest always follow those two rules. The third one, you can get away with some more deviations, and then the fourth and fifth, usually I think people follow them, and if they don't follow them, they have good reasons. So I would, they're kind of in order of importance. So rule 4 is just light moves in straight lines. I think that one's pretty straightforward. You can sort of understand that without further explanation. And then number 5 is light decreases in strength with distance. So the further you get from your light source, the less intense the light should be. There are some exceptions, which are if you have a really shiny object, you'll see reflections that are maybe just as intense as the light source, they just get smaller. So there's small reflections, but equally intense as the light source. And then the other exception is if you have like a much lighter object. So if you have, a character wearing dark clothing, but with light skin, and they're holding up like a glowing orb, the effect of the glowing orb on their face might be a lot brighter than the effect of the glowing orb on the clothing, even if the clothing is closer, because the light colored skin is just so much more reflective than the dark colored cloth.
Okay, they want you to do a recap of rules 3 and 4 because somebody missed rule 3 and somebody missed rule 4.
Okay, I'll just read the 5 rules in order again now that I've gone through all the explanations, just to recap all of them.
And then give your website.
So the first rule is the cardinal rule of OSL, which is lit areas always appear brighter than surrounding unlit areas. Rule 2, lit areas are no brighter than the light source. Rule 3, the apparent color of a lit object is affected by both the color of the object and the color of the light. Rule 4, light moves in straight lines. And Rule 5, light decreases in strength with distance. And this class is based on the object source lighting tutorial on my website, which is over on the left-hand side of your screen, lightminiatures.com. So if you go there, go to the tutorials section, you can find my OSL tutorial, and it goes over these rules. So those are the principles. The next thing I'm going to do, I usually, in my live class, I teach this as a live class at ReaperCon most years when it's not online. And in that case, we'll actually do it hands-on, and I mostly go around sort of giving people suggestions and advice. But this year, it's online, so it's going to be mostly a demo class, and I'll demonstrate one way of painting a lighting effect that's consistent with these rules. So I'm actually going to switch to my document cam at this point, or Anne's document cam, actually.
Haha, he stole it.
I did. Very kindly offered to let me borrow it.
I am answering questions in chat, too.
Oh, yeah, let me know if there's any questions that I should listen to.
Just people coming in late, I'm referring them to your website.
Okay, so our figure is the Nagendra matriarch, and one of the first things I always do for any figure, whether it's going to have object source lighting or not, is I think about what are my light sources. Is there just one light source? Are there multiple light sources? What are their relative strengths? What are their locations? And I try and paint the entire figure with that in mind. And so, especially if OSL is going to be important, the first thing you're going to be thinking about is the object my only light source, or are there multiple light sources? So I showed you the Alchemist as an example with multiple light sources, right? Because I wanted to have a light from above as well as the light from the fire. Obviously, with a fire that's centrally located like this, it's going to be important and it's going to shed a lot of light, but I wanted to be able to put more detail in areas where the firelight wouldn't reach, so I wanted to put a second light source to allow me to do that. Another good example is this figure. Because the light source, the lantern he's holding, is so low down, maybe I'll use a darker background. Because the light source is so low down on the figure, like the light from the lantern wouldn't really reach his face at all, and the face is obviously a key part of any figure. So I really needed to create a second light source that's a light source from above, sort of in balance with that lantern light, in order to be able to paint the full figure. But then if we compare that to this figure I could get away with making the lantern the only light source. And so that's what I decided to do, is pretty much all of the light is coming from the lantern. If you look at her back, it's almost all in shadow. I put a little bit of sort of ambient light in order to show the hair at least, but the lantern is really almost all of the light in this figure. And so with the matriarch, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decide, are there other light sources, or is it just this, fire that she's holding in her hands? And for this figure, because that is sort of right on top and so big and large, I think I am going to make that really the only light source. And then the next thing I'm going to do once I've done that is I'm going to start to paint all of the areas with that in mind. So
move her up a little bit. There you go.
I'm going to have this problem constantly, I can tell.
I am here to corral David's hand. That's why I'm here.
And because I do have that one light source, I think it's easier to start black. I've primed her black because I think with this sort of lighting effect, it's going to be easier to put the light where the light should be rather than to put the shadows where the shadow should be. So I think conceptually it's just a little easier to start dark and work towards lighter areas when we have this sort of figure. So I've primed her black. I'm going to start painting her.
You want to put her in fixed focus first, so figure out comfortably where you're going to be painting her, and hold her at that level with your hand behind it, and hit the light blue button on the camera to fix focus when you're ready.
And I'm going to base coat with some fairly dark colors. I think I'm going to start with the peacock green.
Paradoxical Mouse asks, is there a reason you also primed the fireball black?
The reason I primed the fireball black is because I just used spray primer and I'm priming the entire thing black. But as I suggested, I'm going to paint the light source white as one of my early steps. That's, I think, important for any object source lighting, is to do that. So I am going to do a nice thick white base coat on the fire before I try and put any color into it. So I'm going to get some white out for that. I've got peacock green as my base coat for I think all of the snake skin, actually. Maybe I'll do a troll hide for the bottom scales. Yeah, I think I'll do that. So I'm going to base coat with somewhat dark colors. And in fact, some of these colors are not quite as dark as I would like them to be. So I'm actually going to be adding black to my base coat colors in order to increase the darkness a little bit.
All right, fix her focus first.
Okay.
And you probably need your dark gray behind her, otherwise I don't know how.
Yeah, do you have actually
gray paper?
Yeah, thanks.
And the rescue! The sound effects. We have lots of gray paper. Here you go. I'll just grab one sheet or more. Doesn't matter.
Thank you.
There we are. And yeah, and do fix.
Okay, so I'm going to get her in focus, which
Just hit the blue button and hold it. There you go. She should be good. Unless it's focusing on the thing behind her, but or on your palette, which it could be.
let me make this a little bigger, so hopefully I can see a little better whether it's in focus.
She seems a little off. Let me put my hand there. Do it again. I'm gonna hide your palette. There, perfect.
Okay.
Lovely.
And that will hold it there?
Yes, when you hear the beep, that means it's holding it in focus. It's a really awesome fixed focus.
Okay, so I'm going to start by base coating the snake belly skin, which is going to be a more desaturated color. And this is a mixture of just pure black and the troll hide. And nobody likes to see a base coat, so I'm going to try and move quickly.
Nobody likes base coats. They have no friends. Polak has a question. Can one do OSL on a mini that they painted before when they were just learning? Or is it just easier to start with a new mini with OSL in mind?
So I definitely see people add OSL. I think there's two.
Right on the camera. Oh, you're okay. Never mind. There we go.
I think there's a couple of different tactics for OSL. Some people like to paint everything with the OSL in mind, and other people like to just add a small amount of OSL to an existing model.
Move it to the right a little bit, sweetie. On some of these, it seems to be, yeah, there you
Okay, I should move actually this over so that
yeah, there we go.
I'm centered.
Cool.
And I tend to like the OSL to be a more sort of integrated and dramatic part of the figure, and then so for that reason I like to have it in mind from the beginning. But you can do, if you're going to do like a more limited amount, and let me actually show a quick example. So here's a figure that doesn't really have much OSL and just a little bit more visible from the back. And so it's really a small aspect of this figure. And if you're going to do something like that, I think you can totally add OSL at the end. But if you want to make it a more important part of what you're doing, then it's better to have it in mind from the beginning. So it depends on what you're doing.
So, David, do you start with your light to dark or the opposite? I'm not sure, Kaz. Can you rephrase that for us? Like, do you mean when he's painting the light effect, does he start light and work out, or does he start with shadows and work up? Is that what you're asking?
Okay, now I'm going to switch to the snake, the other scales, the non-belly scales, and those I'm going to make a much more saturated green. And that is the
mini up. There you go.
peacock
a little bit
green.
more. Or move your camera down towards you if you find that you are uncomfortable. To the right a little bit, my love. There you go. Just look up at your monitor. There you go. Takes a while to get in the habit of looking up at the camera. Oh, after you base, do you place where your light is going to be, or start with the shadows? Like more, is it by the figure, or?
I don't think I'm going to just work up one highlight at a time. I am going to highlight and shade each area. Mostly highlight because I'm starting with such a dark base coat. But I don't know if I'm going to be as straightforward as just working from dark to light. I may actually do some wet blending just in the interest of time.
So you're blocking in your darks now?
I'm blocking in my dark base coat.
Move up a little bit. I should just say north, east, west. You're on camera perfectly now.
And I'm trying to use a nice big brush this is a number 3 actually, to speed this up because I have so much area to cover. In my in my live class, I usually use the Goblin Pyro, which is a much smaller figure, which makes it a lot easier for everybody to cover it and highlight and shade it in the time allotted. But we still have another, hour and a half left in this class, so there should be plenty of time.
What color is this again?
This is the Peacock Green 9226, and I am mixing it with black in order to have just a darker base coat.
No problem, Lady War.
What was that?
I'm telling Lady War, no problem. I was going to type it, but...
Yeah, I'm really not very good at checking chat while I'm painting, so it is. Thank you for helping out with this, Anne.
Yeah, it's a learned skill. I mean, I've been doing it for a while now, so. It also helped when I was learning at Reaper because Justin gave us this huge TV screen with all the chat scrolling up. So it was hard to miss at that point. Yay. And her snout.
Yep, I got her snout.
Oh, did you get her snout?
I might need to get the top of her snout. And now I'm going to, I need to do the white, paint the fireball. This is a great figure for OSL. Although Reaper has a lot of great OSL figures with torches and lanterns, I'm doing another OSL figure
Perfect.
For my 4-color challenge. I decided I would get in on the fun because it did look like fun, the 4-color thing. It is an interesting challenge. Well, that green's mixing, but that's okay because this is really just to be a nice bright white layer I can build on, and if it mixes a little bit with the green because there's wet paint right next to it, then I can fix that later because I'll want to do another white coat over this one anyway, just to have a nice solid bright area, base coat area to build on.
Kaz wants to know what colors you chose for the 4-color challenge. Isn't that telling?
Are you gonna follow my 4 colors?
Are you gonna show them the mini? All right.
I'll show them the mini.
Show them the colors.
All
you
right.
don't want to scare people.
So here's the figure.
Yeah, you got it.
Where is it? Oh,
you're good.
I was just looking at the wrong screen. So
yes.
Here's the figure. And I used Nightmare Black, Gothic Crimson, Candlelight Yellow, and Pure White. Those are my 4 colors. For this. So you can easily see the Gothic Crimson and the yellow. And actually the gray, I spent way too much time mixing those together to make gray. Because it's a 4-color challenge. Okay. Back to Snake.
Yay. Move north.
So I need to base coat
north
this part of this arm. And I'm going to base coat the cloth. And I totally neglected to choose a nice brown color, but I'm going to use Redstone Shadow.
Keep her on camera when you are, yeah. You can just sit her up, or yeah, that way.
She's just going to roll away.
She likes to wobble. That's okay.
She likes to roll away.
But otherwise people say off camera because they think that you're actually doing something other than just putting paint on your palette.
I am just putting paint on my palette. So I'm using Redstone Shadow, which sadly was not one of the paints I said I was going to use because, I don't know. I like to make things up as I go along. That's the problem with preparing classes in advance. And this is, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to put this on Pure up here.
Move north just a little.
I'm putting on the Pure Redstone Shadow, but this is way too light to be in the darker. So I'm gonna add. I think I'm gonna add Nightmare Black actually to shade it.
Ooh, it'll go purpley then.
I know. I'm being very. As I said, I like to make things up as I go on. So this is actually the Nightmare Black and the Redstone Shadow mixed. And that, I think, oh, you really can't see
Pull
it.
some water, put some water on it and pull it out maybe. Maybe you can see the color.
Yeah, maybe you can see it a little bit better if I, like...
Yeah.
It's...
Trust
that's
us,
a better base coat color for the darkness I'm going for.
Move north a bit. I think I'm just going to move the camera south for you, hon. Hold on while I do that.
Okay, that'll probably work.
That way, because if you're comfortable there, even if it goes off the edge of the desk, you're still going to be okay. So at least they can see Snack. That's perfect. If that's where you're comfortable holding her, then let's just keep it there.
And there's bubbles.
No.
I hate it when my paint gets bubbles.
What do you do when you get bubbles?
I either like just keep moving my brush over it, or I blow on it. Sometimes you can break the bubbles by blowing on it. And now I'm going to cover the lower parts of the cloth with an even more Nightmare Black in the mix.
We could probably, well, we don't need to zoom in yet. This is all far work.
And she also has some other details like the belt and the dagger and the sack. And maybe I should do, I don't know, I'm debating whether I want to do them or if I just want to do the cloth. I think I do want to do them. And then there's the border of her robe, which is a different color, it seems, than the robe itself. So I'm going to I have a terrible tendency of like mixing just whatever I have on hand on my palette to make other colors. So I'm going to just use a gray or brown that I mixed by basically adding white and black to the other brown for the belt.
So Tiveria says, okay, like a rough sketch. Neat. So this is your chance to tell them that you sketch a lot when you're blocking in a figure.
I do sketch a lot when I'm blocking in a figure. This is true.
Do you just get in the habit of doing that as you learn to paint? Like tackling it like a sketch and then working it like finer? Is that something you learned when you were just starting out, or did you develop that?
I think it was something I developed later. I think I learned to paint like a lot of people learn to paint by doing solid color base coats and then highlighting in step by step. And I think that's a perfectly fine way to start out. I just, you know, as I became more assured of being able to fix problems, I was just felt more freedom to deviate from that kind of very formulaic approach, and now I'm much more chaotic as a painter.
Snake lady. There we go. Now we got
Okay, so I'm going to start highlighting the skin, and what am I going to do to highlight the skin? I think I'm just going to mix peacock green and white, and I want more peacock green because this peacock green has gone very liquid with my wet palette.
At least I'm not the only one.
Yeah, especially I find certain palette papers let a lot more water through. So I'm going to start with a much lighter. I added a lot of white, and I'm going to just sort of put that in where I think it would.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, there you go.
Would be getting light, and I'm not too worried about the scale texture here because I think I'm actually going to highlight this even further. So I'm just covering up all of the scale texture, and then I'll do a later round where I maybe try and start picking out the scale texture a bit. But then what I'm going to do is when I go around the front, I'm going to mix more of just the pure peacock in there to get kind of the roundness of the arm. And it's a little hard for you to see on camera right now because the paint is very reflective right now. And so you're seeing a lot of just sort of the reflections of the wetness.
Up again. You're way off camera. You got to be over the gray paper.
So I'm putting in the lights on her arms and her nose because those are the closest. And I'm not going to worry about her hands right now, although I will talk about them. So one of the things about the hands that's a little interesting is because they're holding the fire, they would actually be fairly close to it and potentially getting a lot of the light reflection, but at the same time, they're going to be a lot darker than the fire itself because they're actually blocking the light and they're just like fire reflecting off snakeskin rather than the actual source of the light. So for that reason, when I paint the hands, I'm actually going to go a fair bit darker than I think. Like the finger right there is probably going to be even lighter than the arm, but because it's so much darker than the fire, I'm going to want it a lot of contrast between the finger and the fire. And it's a little hard to see where the fingers are.
Yeah, they're kind of buried sometimes in the fire, having painted that figure recently. We got a couple of questions in the chat. Chris M. Bandit Squad says, are you thinning with just water, or are you using something to help keep the paint wet, airbrush thinner, etc., that sort of thing?
I'm just thinning with water, and I'm not thinning at all, besides just putting the paint down on the wet palette. And the water in the wet palette is actually thinning the paint a little bit.
No, you're good. And then Kaz wants to know, so do you mix your OSL color into your midtone to help with the overall effect?
Oh, I totally forgot to say what I was doing. So right now, I'm just painting it as a pure white source. So for highlighting and shading, let me take a step back for a moment. Once I've done the dark base coats, I'm going to start putting in the lights. And at that time, you do have a choice. Do you want to put in the color, or do you just want to put in the light? And for Snack, I'm going to follow a process which I like a lot in order to create a lighting effect, which is to just highlight as if you have a pure white light source, and then we're going to put in the color at the end with glazes. So that's why I'm just highlighting with white
North a little bit.
On the snake, is because I know that I'm going to put in a color later on that will change it. I'm going to make it a normal fire color, like a orange, yellowy, white, and that will go well with the skin and with the red cloth I've chosen. So let me talk a little bit about what colors can work well for OSL and how OSL works. So I mentioned before when I was talking about color, the color of the final appearance is going to depend on both the color of the light and the color of the underlying surface. And they mix in a way that's kind of like how paint mixes. So that means that if you have two colors of paint that don't mix to create a very clear color, for example, if I have red light falling on a green surface, red and green make kind of a muddy brown color, And so those two colors are not going to work very well. Like if you have a red light falling on a green surface or a green light falling on a red surface, you're not going to see that light pretty much at all. If green is the only light, if all the light is green, then a red surface is basically going to look like a black surface. Red doesn't really reflect green light, and so it's going to look black under that light. If you have another light source that's like a white light source, then you might see the other light source, and then the red won't really show up at all where it's illuminating a green surface.
So Lebrowski says, kind of leading off of that, so are the colors you're laying down now going to actually affect what you lay down later, or is this more of a guide for what you will do?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to glaze with yellow after I've already created the illusion of a white light source. And that's going to change the color of my light source without without destroying that light that I've already put there. And because I've already created the white light source, then I'm naturally going to follow rules 1 and 2 of OSL because it works without the color I've added, and adding that color is just going to stay within those rules. So that's why I like this process, because it makes it easy to stay within the rules of OSL.
So for people who might be coming in a little later, you said this helps you stay to rule number 1 and number 2. So re-outline those rules real quick.
Okay, yeah, so rule 1 is that the lit areas are going to appear lighter than surrounding unlit areas.
Mm-hmm.
So because I'm making a yellow light source, I am going to eventually glaze with yellow, but I'm not just glazing with yellow. I'm first highlighting before I glaze. And so the fact that I've first highlighted means that that highlight, like here, I'm putting in. Now I'm going to start actually trying to follow the scales a little bit. Because I've first added the highlight, that is going to be lighter than the surrounding unlit areas. And then once I put in the color, it's naturally going to follow that rule.
I think I have to take Kiri out real quick. So I'm gonna
So
leave
I'm
Justin.
on my own.
Well, or is Justin? You should have a disembodied voice, and so they can guide, but it should only take a couple of minutes. Let's go.
I am here.
Hey, so you can let me know when I'm going out of frame, because I have clearly not very good at staying in frame without constant reminders.
Speaking of which, you're a little out of frame there. But also, it's normal for new time streamers.
And then the second rule is no brighter than, lit areas are no lighter than the light source that's illuminating them. And that I'm going to follow just because I've started with a white base coat on my light, and I'm going to make that parts of that are going to be white. And the fact that parts of my light source are white, I'm never going to end up lighter than that. So I don't really have to worry about that. And then the third rule is the color of the surface is influenced by both the color of the light and the color of the underlying surface. And right now, I'm just highlighting with white, and then when I put in my glaze of yellow to be the color of the light, that's automatically going to change the color in a way that's consistent with that rule, because it's going to be influenced both by the yellow that I'm putting over it and by the green that I put underneath. So that's why I like this process, is because it naturally follows those three rules. And then the light moving in straight lines, and that's rule 4, is that light moves in straight lines. I do need to be careful when I'm putting down those lights and shadows to be consistent with that rule. And so actually that shows me that on this arm, maybe I need to darken this part of the wrist a little bit because it would be blocked by the hand. So I'm actually going to reduce that light I've put there a bit by putting some of that base coat over it so that I'm more consistent with that rule. So this should be a good time for me to do a second layer on my white because it will have dried a bit. Since I'm painting on stream, I'm trying to get pretty far in just 2 hours. So I'm going to move back and forth between different areas a bit, and so I can let the paint dry. So I'm going to cover this up with white now that it's already dry and let that dry again, because I want to have this nice opaque white layer to have that really bright fireball that she's holding. And so in order to accomplish that over black primer, I'm going to need a few layers of white paint. And so I'm going to do that in between other things so I can let the paint dry. Let me check chat to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, a little off camera, but you're good now.
Do I usually use a true white instead of an off-white for your light source? You can use... So let me talk a little bit about colors of light and material that work well. So I mentioned that red and green, for example, are not going to work all that well because the red is just going to appear as black. But colors that work well together are colors that mix to make a sort of bright color or clear color, or else desaturated colors. So a desaturated color of material is pretty much always going to be safe for a lighting effect. If you want to have a saturated color, like this green skin is very saturated, then that is only really going to work well with another color that mixes well with green. So my color of light, if it's going to work well with this green skin, probably needs to be either yellow or blue, which are primary colors that mix with green to make, you know, nice saturated. If I mix a yellow with this green, I'm going to get a nice saturated yellow-green. If I mix a blue with this green, I'm going to get like a turquoise. Either way, I'm going to get a nice color, a nice saturated clear color, and so those colors would work well as light sources to illuminate this green skin. For this green, which is a much less saturated green, I have a little bit more freedom where even like an orange light might work okay. But with this skin, a very orange light probably is not going to work very well. So for that reason, I'm going to go with yellow as my light source. If you were going to go with a different color of light source, like a red light source, you might want to have your snake be like a blue snake rather than a green snake, so that that red light, red and blue, mix to make something kind of purplish. You might want to also go a bit magenta with your light because magenta is going to mix a lot better with blue than a more orangey red is going to.
Hydroman wanted you to recap quick what color you used on top of the arms. It was peacock plus white, right?
Yeah, so I used peacock plus black for the base coat, and I highlighted with peacock and then peacock plus white. So
up, north, over the gray.
And I'm really focusing on this area that's very near to the light source because everything else is just going to stay in a lot of shadow. So now that I've put some time into the skin, I'm going to spend some time on the leather. So I started with my redstone base coat. I'm going to add just white into that to highlight as well. So because I'm just trying to create a white light source and I'm going to add color later with a glaze, I can get away with just adding white to highlight. And it can be fun to play with other colors in your highlights, and that's something that I do a fair amount. But because of the process I'm following, where I'm going to be adding another color to my light source at the end, I can just add white and I'll have something that's maybe not the most interesting, but it will become a lot more interesting once I add that glaze.
Wet blending for the win.
And because I'm going so close to this light source, I want to go many, many steps up and have a lot of contrast in order for it to appropriately read as if this fireball is the source of most of the light. Because the amount of light this fireball is going to put, like on that head, which is just a few inches below it, is much, much more significant than the amount of light it's going to put further away. And I'm also trying to reflect some of the folds of the fabric to create more interest.
Paradoxical Mouse has a question. How do you deal with areas such as between the hood and the fire, where obviously it would normally be brighter than a lot of areas, but is naturally in shadow due to the miniature shape?
So the main thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to be making that light source really, really dramatic. You're right that the fact that the miniature naturally casts shadows on itself is going to sort of fight your lighting effect. And the best way to deal with that is just to make your lighting effect really, really punchy so that it can hopefully overwhelm that effect. So now I'm going to work on the front.
A little bit to the right. No, that would be better. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, even in shadow, that shadow is annoying, especially with the bright light sources I have right above it. It would be a little bit less of a problem, actually, in, if it were just on a tabletop without that really strong lamp right above it. And even with that shadow that's being cast, it's just so much lighter up here than down here that it still looks light with that shadow. So I'm not going to worry too much about it, but you're right that is something that you want to think about. And for that reason, sometimes you want to avoid doing lighting effects in areas which are too shadowed. So like if you want to have a dragon's belly be glowing,
Right and north.
if you want to have a dragon's belly glowing, but the dragon is sort of walking on all fours, that's probably not going to work very well because you're fighting with such a large shadow that the dragon's going to cast. So yeah, 2 tips. 1 is avoid doing it in areas of really deep shadow, and 2 is just make sure your light is very dramatic and strong enough to overpower whatever natural shadows the figure is casting.
Unless you're a glutton for punishment, decide to put an LED light inside of the hood so that you can get away with your lighting effect, David. Don't know anybody who's done that.
I have, yes. It's that's another option, although only reserved for if you're going to put a lot of time and effort into one model.
Go right. There you go. Perfect.
So I've created a very, I'm actually putting in some midtones now because I went so strong with that highlight that I want to just sort of blend it in a bit, make it. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks from the back. It's got a nice amount of contrast. I think I'm actually going to look at it from above to kind of line things up, and I think I've lined up where it goes from light to dark pretty well. I might reduce a little bit here to try and actually I think I'm gonna put a little bit light. This is probably not quite right, but I'm gonna do it anyway.
Learn the rules so you can break them is the lesson here. So tell us why that's not quite right, David. And you're doing it anyway. But you need to explain why it's not right.
I wanted to put just a little bit of detail of folds into the area where the firelight wouldn't cast. And so I'm putting just a little bit of highlight, much less dramatic than the fire cast light. But really what this is simulating is that there's just a little bit of ambient light in addition to the light from the fire. And the fact I'm keeping it much less strong than the firelight because I want that to be just a minimal amount of ambient light, and most of the light is from that fireball.
Move north. Remember over the gray. Good.
I'm going to look down. I'm looking down that angle. It's all blurry because out of focus, but that's sort of the direction I'm looking at it to figure out where the fire would cast. The two tricks to see whether something, to be consistent with that light moves in straight lines rule, the two directions you want to look from or is look from the part of the miniature to see if you can sort of see the light source, or look from the light source to see if you can see that part of the miniature. This is a lot easier if you have an off-camera light source. Like if I had a light source that was the tip of my brush looking at the miniature, I could just look at the miniature from this spot to see what part I could see, to see what parts would be illuminated. If I'm trying to see from this ball what parts it would be able to illuminate, I need to kind of line up the figure in such a way that I can look at it from that angle and then use that to guide my guessing. So one thing that I'm going to notice is that there would be a little bit of illumination on these scales down here where it comes out that you're not really going to get here. So I'm going to actually leave this area pretty dark, but I'm going to start putting in just a little bit of lights down here. And that needs to be much less light than is on the the parts that are much closer to the fire, because this is so much farther away than this. This is going to get a lot less illumination than this, but it should still get some.
A little bit north. A little bit onto the gray.
So I'm putting in just a little bit of light here. And now I'm going to do the same with the green. I think for the green, I'm actually just going to go to the pure peacock green, since that should be lighter than the surrounding.
You might need a touch of white because peacock's very transparent.
I can't, because it's still wet, it will actually appear to cover better than it does when it dries. So I'm going to leave it how it is for now, and then see whether, because right now it actually looks like it's covering well enough, but then once it dries, it might look like it actually hasn't covered quite well enough. And here, these scales are big enough that I can pretty easily paint each scale individually and kind of leave the dark lines between them. And again, I really want to have just a little bit of light here. And again, I don't think I can exactly see any of this from that fireball, but I'm just going to cheat and put a little bit right in the center of the scales just to have at least some contrast on that part of the figure. And I think I can get away with it. So I'm trying to put it. I wish the snake did not have these giant boobs. They cast like really large shadows, which is inconsistent with the lighting effect that I want to do. Plus, like, snakes are not mammals, so why do they have boobs? It doesn't make sense.
Ask whoever sculpted the snack lady.
Ron, if you're watching.
Tell Chris Lewis. Actually, probably was designed by Izzy, and Ron probably did have a hand in it.
I'm assuming Ron is at least partially to blame for every figure in Reaper's line.
Yes.
Although that's...
So if you want to use that, you can. It's the card of the snake, so that you guys know the figure, if you didn't. Now I'm going to compare your paint job to my paint job and see if I know I also cheated just a little.
And so now the next thing I want to do is I want to deal with all of these, the borders on
Ron
the
is
cloth.
watching.
Excellent.
Hydromain says, so for the layers on the robe, did you just add white to the same red to brighten it? Go north a little, honey.
Sorry, what was the question?
So for the layers on the robe, did you just add white to the red to brighten it?
Yeah, I added white to brighten it, and I added Nightmare Blue, or not Nightmare Blue,
Nightmare Black.
Nightmare Black. Right, that's right. You were telling me people always
Yes, miscall it, because it is a very, very dark blue.
And actually the reason I use blue to shade is because I know I'm going to do yellow as my light source, and I can kind of kick that up a bit if I use the complementary color to yellow, which is like a cold blue, as my shadow color. So that, even though I'm just highlighting with yellow because I'm planning to add that light via glazes later, I am thinking about color more in my shadows.
Go north and right. There you go.
And of course, you don't have to follow this technique that I'm following of highlighting just with white and then glazing. You could add your light source color in your highlights as an alternative, and that would also let you have a good effect that's consistent with the, OSL principles that I was talking about earlier. But the main difference, I don't know where that finger is supposed to be. Maybe there. I'm just going to paint in fingers. No, I don't think that's right at all.
Well, you can still block it over. It's acrylics. You can always paint over it.
Yeah.
Somebody suggests that the boobs are from venom sacs. Green 7 says that the boobs are obviously venom sacs. Yes.
I really think only mammals should have boobs. Just to be scientific with our anthropomorphic animals.
There you go. Perfect. That's a
I
perfect
don't mind
position.
when fox ladies have giant boobs, because foxes at least are mammals. But I like to be scientific with my anthropomorphic animals.
Turn right. There you go.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I wanted to do this border to the cloth, and I decided I would
North.
rebase coat in order to get a nice black line around the lining of the cloth. I just thought it would be easier to paint that black first to get that black line, and then I'm going to paint it. I think I'm going to do it just in a kind of light gray. So one thing to keep in mind is because I'm painting this figure as though this light source is the majority of the light, I'm keeping everything fairly dark, sort of away from the light. And the midtones are really only the colors that you see somewhat near the light, kind of on the boundary between the highlight color and the shade color. So really I'm only seeing midtones up here, and everything else is much darker. And what that means is that the true color of the material that I'm thinking of is like, you know, this kind of brown here, this kind of green here. And so for a lightish gray trim, I'm going to put that light gray here, but it's going to go down to like dark gray pretty quickly at the bottom of the sleeves, and down here it's also going to be a fairly dark gray. So even though I'm thinking that I have a light gray for my trim, a lot of the color that I paint is actually going to be a dark gray.
North. There you go.
Yeah, one thing I've found is that the more I'm trying to control my brushstrokes precisely, the more I kind of contort myself in order to do that, and the more likely I am to end up off camera. So here is my light gray that is the actual true color of this trim. And I'm going to just put it in this midtone area here. I'm going to put it in this midtone area here. I'm going to put it in the midtone areas on the front, which are like here.
Oh, I'm missing some chat.
And here.
I didn't catch up on chat, and Sarduki is like, every Kickstarter, I assume there's an all-hands meeting where they decide which anthropomorphic minis will have boobs and which will not. It's probably by sculptor, actually, Sarduki. Ron could, well, Ron can take the responsibility if he wishes, but... So, Rainbow Sculptor, who I think is Christine, right? So you're not mixing the light color with the local color as you go? Not yet, I believe, right?
No, I'm going to add the light color. I'll try to add it with about half an hour left, and then you'll see how that changes things when I add the color of the light in.
Because you're going to use it glazes, correct?
Yes. And that part is actually relatively fast, and it makes a huge amount of difference.
Reaper Ron says, boobs, no boobs, to each his own. Loving the OSL class, David. Somebody points out, AZ Barbarian points out, snakes don't have arms either. Good point, good point.
That's a very, very valid point. I think I already lampshaded that with my comment about science and my anthropomorphic animals, but yes.
Bandar has an excellent point. Boob or no boobs, it is not wise to argue with a woman wielding a fireball. grim with the funny. No, honey, I wasn't staring at that girl's boobs. I was looking at the way the light falls under them. Mini painter one-liners for the win.
I like that one. That's a good one.
I'm researching natural shadows. Yes, exactly, Vanda. Oh, Hydroman, now you're opening up a box of a horrible can of worms. So what if you want to do a black fire, quote unquote? Well, that's magical.
All right, now I'm going to paint her bracelets, and I think we're gonna make those
right north.
I need to figure out what color I'm making her bracelets.
I'm always telling him to go northeast, guys. David likes to live in the southwest, apparently, but we actually live in the west, so not sure. We may be a little geographically challenged. Yeah.
I'm going to do some NMM gold for her bracelets because they just seem like they should be gold.
Hydroman, I'm going to field that one. Black fire, I mean, the only way you can really do it is to have it glow dark purple, in which case your mini's going to be black and dark purple. It's like the only way to do it, because your fire source is not light at that point, so there's no way to OSL it. That you can't possibly suggest. If you have no light that's not black, then you have a mini imperfect shadow, essentially, is what you've got. There's no way to OSL it that I know of.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about what are the physics of black fire that you're trying to simulate. But the problem with this is simulating, like, it's hard enough to simulate real physics in a convincing enough way that the viewer understands what's going on. So if you're trying to simulate, like, make-believe physics so that your viewer understands what's going on, it just seems maybe even impossible. I probably would not try.
That is the war that David would choose not to fight.
So I'm just base coating her bracelets to be NMM gold. And I just mixed up something with yellow and redstone just because that was on my palette and that's how I normally paint.
Right north. Very good. Perfect. So what's funny to me is that you're almost doing, up to this point, and when you added the yellow, you were almost doing a 4-color paint challenge. Because you had the green, the redstone, the white, and, like, the black, I guess, for gray. Or the blue, the nightmare blue.
It does look way better from the back than the front. Gonna put in some of the light here.
Oh, diggity. Fast forward to ReaperCon 2021, where David wins Best in Show with an incredibly executed black fire model.
Yeah, I think that is extremely unlikely.
Now you've got me thinking, though. That's the problem is, like, I'm like, how would you? You'd have to have your shadow emanating like light, and you'd have to invert everything. It would have to be a negative. You'd have to do it like a negative.
Yeah, I mean,
like
you could have it like...
Up north and you're out of camera. Way out
and
of
I'm
camera.
probably...
There you go. Much better.
Yeah, now I'm actually trying to paint these scales. Okay, so now my first coat of my NMM is probably dry enough that I can put on some of the light. So I'm just going to mix a lot of white in with my yellow and redstone to be the highlight. And
north. There you go. You're barely on camera. Over the gray is best. Oh, you're off camera again. There you go. It's like you got to get to a comfortable angle. I know. There you go. You're perfect now. You're absolutely perfect. I mean, you're my boyfriend. You're perfect all the time. But you're absolutely perfect on the camera now. The thing with those blacks, Mike M, is it's just the finish. So although you could possibly make different degrees of black using those different, like the black 2.0 and all that, it would only work on camera. And then it would look a little weird in real life.
I mean, the other thing you could try to do for something like that is try and find an artist who has executed effectively in 2D art, because 2D art is easier than 3D art in some ways, because you're not fighting with natural shadows, and because it is just a two-dimensional picture, the brain is kind of more willing to accept liberties. So if you can find somebody who has convincingly done it in 2D, you could try and figure out how to adapt it to 3D.
That's a good suggestion.
I don't know if anybody has successfully made Blackfire in 2D though.
Well, it's on the internet because you mentioned it, so. No, drop camera. Great. It's worth mentioning that when David goes off camera for these brief periods of time, he's actually like holding the model out to look at it and assess it.
That's not quite what I'm doing.
Some of what
Sometimes it's what I'm doing, but sometimes I'm just trying to like get, you know, precise lines in between the bracelets.
But you should talk to people about how you hold
Yeah.
the out and look at it to judge the light.
That is something that I probably should be doing more than I am. Actually, what I was doing is I was just looking at it on camera to judge the light, because that actually works just as well as, you know, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll hold it out at a distance to judge it, but looking at it on camera to judge it also can give you a good sense. And I feel like from the back, the light is actually working reasonably well. From the front, I don't think it's working too well. One issue, actually, is I think this highlight is too light. So I'm going to tone that down a little bit. And then this needs to be blended a little more.
Yeah, the camera is very, very good, Coos. Agreed. He's like, I really want to get an IPvo for recording hobbying. Everybody's still stuck on Blackfire. I expect lots of very crazy attempts for next ReaperCon.
And by the way, if anybody has a question that either we missed or you didn't get a chance to ask it, I'll be in my Artist Alley channel after this class, so you can also ask there. So now I'm just doing some lining between the scales to help that read better. Some of you may have noticed that I hold my brush in a very strange way. Most people hold their brushes more like this, and I have developed the habit of holding it like this, which I don't necessarily think I would recommend it. That's how I got used to it in the first place, and now it's really hard to change. Sometimes I wish I'd sort of gotten into the habit of doing it the other way when I first started painting.
Luthar in Texas asks, which paints are you using? Sorry, came late to the stream. I think it's Peacock Green, Nightmare Black, and what's your yellow?
Yeah, so I've been using, that's for the main snake skin. This is for the snake skin belly. This is for the cloth, and then white and black. And I have candlelight yellow that I'm going to be using for the fire. Let me put another white base coat on the fire because it really needs it at this point.
Hey, you're not alone. Ninja Me Timbers just says, I just realized I'm holding my brush that way and I didn't know it was weird. Well, you're in good company, Ninja.
Yeah, I think like 30% of people who paint or something do it that way, but it's definitely the minority.
How long is your class, David? 2 hours?
It is a 2-hour class, so it's...
We have 40 minutes left, but we need to end probably just a tad early to for setup. Is that correct?
Justin? I'm not...
Sorry, I was addressing something else. Say that again.
Do we need to end early for setup for the next stream, or should I end this right at 5?
That's really up to you guys. I mean, at this point, we've kind of allowed for you to go entirely up to 5, but if you're done by 4:45, I mean, that would help. But it's entirely up to you. You have the entire period of time if you would like it.
Okay. I will probably go until close to 5. I'll try and end a few minutes early if I can. So, going to do this little bit. And we have a really stark line there. So one thing, you know, this is where blending is really important, is because round surfaces naturally create blends and angles naturally create harsh lines. So if you have a harsh line, it'll read as an angle. And if that's not what you want, then you should blend that in a bit in order to make it not read as that kind of an angle.
Mocha's grip is even weirder. Wow. Now I'm going to have to get them together at the next ReaperCon and compare. Kaz wants to know if you'll continue painting this figure on your Alley Discord.
No, I think I'm going to call it done. I might go back to painting my 4-color figure. Painting under a document camera is really awkward.
You're telling me. Right, north. So
I think I'm going to stop painting under a document camera as soon as I possibly can.
What's up, Kiwi? You good? What's up, girlie? Do you need to go out? I'm trying to help. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Just tell me what you need, little dog, and we'll get it done. Yeah. You just tell me what you need, and we'll do it. If you need to go out, you can go out. Starting to maybe look a little bit shiny. That's my good dog. Are you going to settle, or are you going to go somewhere? You need to tell me what I need to do. So I'm just trying to like clean up the fingers a little bit. And do a little bit of light here. Good girl. I'll take you out after this, okay? Won't bring your sleep. I think I am going to start to bring out some of the details on the leather, just a little bit of light and shadow, and I'm gonna hit because this would also be visible from the light source.
Oh, and I missed this whole line of the lining of the fabric. So let me do that.
You've got about 5 minutes, and then you will be at half an hour from end, just so you know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Kaz says, since the M&M bracelet is so close to the light source, will it have reflected light as well, or no? Because it's very close to the light source.
It will, and I was trying to think about where the reflection would be from the light source, and that's why I kind of tried to at least suggest the light coming from the direction of the fireball. It would kind of hit the rim of each bracelet that faces towards the fireball, especially in the center of the rim as you face it. So I was kind of going in that with my lighting. Um,
Grim work requires me, and I don't know why this is part of it, but Grim says, and have him bathed and brought to your tents so he can teach us this. Make him paint more under the camera.
what?
I don't know why I need to bathe you first. Like, it's not like you're, like, extremely stinky or anything.
I did take a shower this morning.
Yeah, he's very good about, it's one shower a day at a con, right?
Yeah.
He's following the con rule just fine.
Yeah, you have to shower every day, and being at a con is no excuse, even an online con.
A little bit to the right. Yeah, there you go. Oop. As is tradition.
And one thing that I've noticed is that I don't quite have the shadow I should between the hood and the shirt. So I'm going to put that back in again. And also down here.
Over left. Luther in Texas says, did you use a light source in the beginning to get an understanding of which areas would be shadowed, like hold a small flashlight over the fireball?
I could have done it that way, but that's not what I actually did. What I actually did when I was trying to figure out where the light would fall and not is I looked at it from the direction of the light source. So kind of line up the light source with your eye and see, okay, I can see from this edge of the light source here down the front, I can see like this part of the scales there, but it looks like, this part here would be blocked, if that makes sense at all.
Okay, so apparently it was an Arabian marriage ritual, and it implied that you are a slave, and I was presenting him to the rest of my court. I think that is not, in fact, our relationship, so I'm not going to have you bathed and dragged to my tent.
Okay, good then. That was weird.
Yes, that's definitely gone weird. Like, chat has gone sideways.
I'm going to do... I think I'm going to actually put in the yellow, and anything that I want to clean up after that, I will clean up after the yellow. So now that I have put in my lights and shadows, hopefully it reads like there's light coming from the direction of this fireball. And I do see some areas where, like, there would be more down the side of this arm, I think, because it's not just, right, it's coming from this direction, so it's actually getting more of the arm than I had it on the back. And then the inside of the lower arms, or the upper arms, rather.
You are just about at the half an hour mark.
Yeah, I really want to add the yellow at this point. So I'm going to clean my brush really well now because I've been using all these other colors that I don't want to introduce into the yellow when I do this thin glaze. And hopefully I've created, like, your goal at this point before you put in the color is to have sold a white light source. I don't think I've done that well from the front because there's just so much of the snake body that would be in shadow. It's just, I'm fighting that a little bit. From the back, it's actually much easier, and there I think I've done it reasonably well, suggested that we have this light source. But the better you can sell that illusion with just the white light, the better this next step will work. And for the next step, what I'm actually going to do is I'm introducing color, and I've chosen to use candlelight yellow as the color of the light. And I was painting everything with that color in mind, even though I hadn't ever touched it yet. I'm trying to pick colors where I can glaze over it with that yellow, and it will change the color in a pleasing way. So red and yellow make a nice orange, so that red should mix well with the yellow. And then the bluish green actually should work really well because it will turn into a much more yellow green where the yellow light is hitting it, but keep that nice blue hue in the other areas. And so I think that'll work well. And then the other green, the much more desaturated green, kind of olivey green, we'll see how that works. I'm not sure about that. And then the gray also, yellow and gray, will just make a yellowish gray, so that should work quite well too. So I'm going to take my yellow and I'm just going to thin it into a thin glaze with a fair amount of water. And I'm just going to put that everywhere I've highlighted pretty much. And I have too much in my brush, so it's turning into more of a wash, and I want it to be more of a glaze. So I'm just going to reduce the amount that's in my brush, and then I'm going to spread it, what I've already put on the miniature, over more area in order to tone it down. And so now
I've got a couple of questions from chat. I'm gonna do the Hoke Diggity one first, and then get back to you, Ninja. Hoke Diggity asks, what can a painter do to build that mind bank of color interaction? Would you say that it comes with time and consciously practicing with many varied colors?
I think taking a color theory class is helpful if you do exercises like the 4-color model. That can be really effective. Like, can you paint a model with just 4 colors, and what 4 colors should you choose? And if you're going to paint, you might want to try out. So yeah, I guess I would encourage everyone to do that 4-color challenge, because that'll force you to mix paint. The more you practice mixing paint, the better a sense you'll have about how paints mix. And before you choose, or when you're choosing what 4 colors to use, try just picking 4 colors and mixing them and seeing what kind of other colors can you get when you mix them. And one tip is, you want to have both lights and darks, and you want to have maybe a few different primary colors. So the reason I chose the 4 colors I chose for the 4-color challenge, which for anyone who missed that part, was the Nightmare Black, the Gothic Crimson, the Candlelight Yellow, and White, was so that I would have some really dark colors, the Nightmare Black and the Gothic Crimson, and some very light colors, in this case the Pure White, and I have a blue, a red, and a yellow. And that lets me mix a lot of different colors with the colors I chose. So try an exercise like that. Maybe try 4 different colors than the ones I chose, but try and choose something that's a red. Maybe like the Redstone Shadow could be a really good red for that challenge.
Next one would be Sadie, and she's also taken Grim. Sorry. And then the other question we had was Ninja V Timbers, which is a little more broad of a question. Any tips for OSL where you have a main light source already? I think that David's alchemist bust that you showed at the beginning might be a good answer for that, Ninja. But go ahead, David.
Yeah, so I think that's a good example of that. The two tips I have are think about the relative strengths of your two light sources. Do you want one to be much stronger, or I probably would want to have them be similar in strength to have them be appropriately balanced. So if you're going to have two similarly strong light sources, you need to make sure that they're both illuminating to about the same degree. And maybe you want to make the one of them be much more concentrated than the other be more diffuse. So much more contrast between the light and shadows from one compared to the other is something that you might do.
Hand is in front of the model. There we go. Also, a lot more questions popping up.
And the other thing that you might want to do is try and leave, when you have those two, think about, what happens. Do they overlap, or are they coming from two directions where they're not really going to overlap? So one thing that I did with my alchemist
example mini
is I tried to make sure that, because for a lot of the figure,
south a little and east.
Oops.
There you go.
For a lot of the figure, it's right above my light source, and it's right below my other light source. So they're coming from opposite directions. They're not going to mix too much. And what that lets me do is that between the light of the one and the light of the other, I can put this like area of shadow.
You can see it on the turban
that
really well.
helps you see that they're two different light sources. Also in the face, I tried to put like bits of shadow, like in the cheeks, a little line of shadow between the green light source from below and the white light source from above to help your brain interpret these and your eye interpret these as two different light sources. So those are some tips for that.
Okay, paradoxical mouse. When doing the color glaze, are there any sorts of surfaces that you may just leave highlighted with their natural color, the white without the glaze? Maybe NMM?
For a mini like this, where almost all of the light is coming from the colored light source, I'm really going to try and hit pretty much every area where I've put light with that color to color the light, because I know that my light has that color. Everywhere that's lit is lit with that color of light. So for this figure, no.
North.
If I was doing something like the two different light sources, then I would definitely have that, because I would be trying to color one of my light sources yellow while leaving the other light source
whatever it is.
Yeah. And so you see how much I've changed things with this yellow glaze. That now all of the stuff that was not really reading as, it just reads much more clearly as light from the fireball because I've done that glaze. So now the next thing I'm going to do is, yeah, especially on the back, like I think it reads a lot better as yellow, as light from the fire with all of this yellow, because we're used to seeing, also this is like going along with what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing very yellow light sources like incandescent light bulbs or candles or firelight. We're used to seeing this as a color of light in darkness, and so that makes it easier to sell this illusion. But again, it still works, I think, much better from the back, and it works a little bit from the front, but nowhere near as well as it works from the back.
Quick question, can you use actual metallics in an OSL scheme like this, or do you have to use NMM? Unfriendly Ghost asks.
That's a very good question, because one thing that metallics do is they reflect the actual lights in your environment and not the sort of fictional lights that you're trying to create with paint. And it's very difficult to like create a reflection just where you want, even if you're highlighting and shading your metallics by using like shinier metallics or less shiny metallics.
I did it on my snake lady. She's not done, but I tried it on the sleeve. Yeah, you have to force it. You have to force your shadows by using opaque paints, and force your highlights by maybe picking, if you pick like a gold metallic and you're using a yellow light source, you can push it that way.
Yeah, but as I was saying, even if you are highlighting and shading your metallics, which I always like to do with metallics, I think it gives better results. But even if you're doing that, it's still going to naturally reflect the lights in the environment and not the light you're trying to create, even if you try and force it with those things. So I think it's always going to look not quite as good. And that's not necessarily a big problem. Like I use metallics on this guy, but mostly I'm using metallics where it's reflecting the natural light source. And then actually you can see a little bit on the bottom of the little metal thing on the monkey's turban. I've put in like an NMM reflection there. So one thing that you might even do is do NMM for the light source reflections, the object light source reflections, and metallics for where there would be natural
Interesting
lights and
idea.
shadows.
Interesting idea. Al Capone asks, so at this point you are establishing general values, almost like an underpainting, and then glazing color over the top as a filter. Would that be accurate?
Yes, that's a good summary of what I've done with this figure. Thank you.
Let me see. Got one more question on Borowski. He said it's a OSL question. It doesn't pertain to this many. Feel free to skip it. But what's a quick and dirty explanation of how to add OSL with NMM? Like if the bracelets on this one were metal or she had a dagger, would it just depend on the shape, position of the metal piece?
Yeah, so the way I paint NMM is I am always putting in the reflections that I think you should see with paint. I'm not just painting a bracelet with NMM colors. I'm trying to think about, where is my light coming from? Where would that light be reflected? And use that to place my highlights and my shadows and my midtones. And sometimes with NMM, I even have like other colors that are just reflections of the environment. And so if I'm thinking about those, one of the things I'm thinking about is, okay, I have a light source. How is that going to reflect? So actually my 4-color mini is a good example of that, where she has metal armor and she's holding a lantern. So I'm actually putting in the reflection of the lantern on her armor, where I think her armor would reflect the lantern, as well as having, that lantern light show up on like this little, I don't even know what this, it's like an urn on her belt, and the leather work and I haven't put in all of the light that I should. I have some on the fabric, the purple fabric here, but I probably need more there. But yeah, I'm trying to think about how the light that she's holding would interact with that metal and paint the highlights and the shadows appropriately in the NMM.
Trixie Kitty asks, also got an OSL question, not for this mini. How would you suggest painting a mini that has very little shadow due to the source without it being one solid highlight color?
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, like what, Trixie? Elaborate a little. I'm like thinking of like just like something really smooth, but you'd still have shadow. If you give us an example, Trixie, we can tackle it. I'm just watching chat.
I'm trying to think about how that would ever happen
Like you'd have to have a surrounding light. Like it'd almost have to be science fiction where you had like an even light, like coming from walls and ceiling, maybe. So you only ever had shadow like underneath the model, and maybe it's a very smooth, like rounded form where your shadow is minimized. Where there's fire surrounding a wizard. Oh, like maybe a ring of fire around Minnie?
Okay. Yeah, so I have an example to show you for that.
Oh, where is it? Do I have to move?
No, it's this guy. So a good example of that is this guy. And he was tricky for the reason you're talking about, because he has so much fire. He has this giant fireball that's swirling around him and this other fire in his hand. And that means, like, if I think about where this fire would cast light, it's pretty much the entire front surface of the figure is going to have light from the fire. And even like the front and bottom part of this arm has light from that fire. And then this fire is just mostly getting the top of this arm. But I think that makes the fire read less well than it would if it were a single point source. One thing that you can do is, because it's the front, I can have a lot more light from the front than compared to the back. So it gets dark back here and is light on the front. But it is kind of spread across the entire front half of his body with that fire. And so that definitely makes the effect more challenging to do. I'm still trying to think about what areas would be illuminated and how much. And so I feel like all of like the areas that are near the fire would be maybe more than the side of the leg here that's away, and the side of his arm here is far enough from this light. But it's hard to think about where the light would be, and so it probably doesn't read quite as well as the ones that have a more of a point light source.
Right, yeah, D.L. Kinney said, well, what about like a light source on top of a cone or pyramid where essentially it's falling evenly down sides? I mean, at that point, it's just the strength of the light source, right? Relative?
Yeah, so for a light source at the tip of a pyramid, um, that's where you can use the fact that it gets less strong with distance. So it would be, um, much more lighter near the apex of the pyramid and darker, and you can kind of do a gradient down the side of the pyramid, and that would start to establish it. And then the other thing you could do with that pyramid is, um, let's see, what can I paint on?
The gray paper.
I can paint on the gray paper?
Sure, go.
Okay. So if I were doing a pyramid, I would probably, let's say I have, again, a yellow light at the apex, and then it's maybe a red stone pyramid. So it's going to be, each side of the pyramid is going to be kind of a gradient between these colors. I should use a bigger brush for this. So we have our apex of the pyramid down to the brown, and we're kind of blending between these. I'm not going to take the time to get a perfectly smooth gradient, but I'll try to get it somewhat smooth. So doing that, that's one thing that I would do, is try and create that gradient where you have more light closer to the light source and less light farther from the light source. But the other thing that I would try to do is I would try to put in some lines, like maybe the pyramid is out of individual blocks. And what you can do is you can kind of put in that line of shadow for like the tiers of the pyramid. And so you get that line of shadow. And then what you would have is, on the opposite side of the line of shadow, you would have a part that catches the light a little bit. And so like this. Maybe this one should be not quite as.
Yeah,
right?
good enough.
And now you can sort of read it as separate lines, as like an indentation that catches the light, and that helps you see that the light is coming from this direction.
A couple more questions. Kick
Wanted to give you
ports.
a
How
10-minute
would you go
warning
about a
here, by
character
the way.
with opposing
Thanks.
light source colors, like glowing ice orb and fire orb in each hand?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. And with fire and ice, you can do with like a blue light source and a yellow light source, and both blue and yellow, because they're primary colors, they work very well as light source colors. So,
Will you change the color of the light to combine at the center? That's one thing he asked. Like if they cross, if the light crosses past, does that change the color of the light combine? Does that cause it to combine, or do you get that dark line?
So if you have both yellow light and blue light falling on a figure, they're going to combine not quite like paint combines. So I mentioned that if you have like a yellow light falling on a blue surface, the yellow and the blue, the yellow light and the blue surface are going to interact kind of like paint colors combine. So yellow and blue make green with paint, and so yellow light falling on a blue surface is also going to make green. But with different colors of light, it's not quite the same thing at all. It's not the same thing at all, I should say. Yellow light and blue light do not combine at all like paint. So paint colors combine what's called subtractively. Uh, if you're like at all familiar with color science or light science, that means that um, the sort of blue paint and the yellow light paint are both created.
Just put a mini on the camera for people to see. You don't have to use it as a reference. Just keep something in front of them.
Yellow paint and blue paint both kind of take out parts of the spectrum. Like the blue paint will not reflect yellow or green or red wavelengths of light, and so it kind of removes them. And if you mix that with yellow paint, that's going to take out the blue parts of like the purple parts of the spectrum, and some of the blue parts, you're going to be left with something that mostly just reflects the green. And that's because yellow paint actually reflects like everything from green to red and just takes out purple. And blue kind of reflects everything from green to purple and just takes out like red and orange. And so when you mix them, you're taking out everything except the green, and so it's kind of mixes subtractively and they make green. But when you take yellow and blue light, they mix very differently. So if you've ever like worked with HTML colors or web colors, if you have yellow, yellow is actually illuminating both the red and the green phosphors of your monitor. And if you add blue to that, you're actually illuminating the entire, every color of your monitor. And when you're doing additive colors, yellow and blue actually make white. So if you have yellow and blue, let's say I had like a blue light source coming from over here. If they're not going to overlap, then I'm doing like, maybe I just have like a glowing blue mace. In the areas where they're not overlapping, like the blue base could maybe do like a blue OSL effect over here, and the yellow lantern can make a yellow OSL effect over here, and together that's creating like two separate lighting effects that each work individually. That's a lot simpler. If I have the yellow and blue right next to each other, they're kind of just going to act like a single white light source for anything in their overlap. And so if I have, a yellow light source here and a blue light source here, and they're overlapping here in like a white light, that's going to be a lot harder to sort of sell. So I would say it probably works a lot better if they're far enough apart that they're not like their lights are not really overlapping. If they did overlap, like according to physics, that would make a white light. but would that really read as a lighting effect if you're looking at a miniature? I don't know if it would read very effectively.
Because
So
it's more an optical illusion. It's more the kind of thing people don't expect, right? Because it's counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I had to sort of think through the physics to figure out what would go on kind of means that I haven't seen it enough that, like, if you just paint it, it's going to be visible. So it may
Put
be...
Snake on.
Yeah, I should put
You were
the snake
painting
on.
Snake, and some people are painting Snake with you, so there we go. There we go.
Oh, yeah, so for everybody who's trying to follow, maybe I'll just put her on the back, because I like her back a lot better than her front.
That's fine.
It's sad.
So Rainbow Sculptor asks, apparently I missed a really amazing mini you painted with minimal OSL. Would you mind doing a glance at the minis you've shown thus far, or are they all in your gallery? I guess I should ask. Like your Discord gallery.
Which mini?
Which mini do you know, Rainbow Sculptor? I think that probably the Cleric is the most minimal one because she's still in progress.
Yeah.
Is there another minimal OSL mini around that you showed earlier?
I can't think of one.
Okay, so probably the Cleric.
All right.
Cool. And then somebody said, Pharaonic says, awesome lesson. My snake came out way better than expected.
So I think maybe this is a good place to stop because I know ReaperCon's trying to like give some time before the next class. But if anybody has any question that I didn't have a chance to answer before the end of the class, then please come to my Artist Alley channel and I'll be there answering questions for at least the next half hour or so.
Alrighty.
And
All right. Well, thank you guys very much.
thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bunny ears.
Don't forget to tune in for Reaper, guys.